Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Theory Podcast. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Nicolas Tajan, Associate Professor at Kyoto University's Graduate School of Human and Environmental Studies. Nicolas' work involves the research of psychiatry, psychopathology, and the history of psychology, and Lacanian analysis, and a variety of other related interests. I encountered his work online, whereupon he forwarded me a paper regarding his research into the phenomenon of social isolation, familiar to the contemporary landscape of Japan, this phenomenon known as Hikikomori. And what interested me about this paper was its use of the work of Fuko, as it endeavored to explain how we can use the work of Fuko to better elaborate a framework to understand the nature of social isolation as a form of thinking about abnormality in the neoliberal milieu and beyond. Nicolas, thank you for having this interview with me today.
Thank you to come to Kyoto University.
Could you just say a little bit more about yourself and your work?
I'm a clinician by training and a psychoanalyst, so it means that I'm meeting people coming at my office to people who are talking about their personal issues, and that's what interests me most. And then let's say the theory comes after, basically. So I'm first a clinician, a caregiver, someone who takes care of people, and then the teaching and the research comes after.
And working here at Kyoto University, I mean, for many Westerners would seem like a very unusual teaching experience. I'm curious what your experience has been like teaching in Japan. How might it differ, for example, from teaching in France or in the United States or elsewhere in the West?
Well, what's very different, I think you also have an experience as a teacher in Japan.
That's
as
right.
An ALT in other settings. And perhaps, there's also a connection to Hikikomori here, social isolation and school dropout.
Yeah.
So if you look at, the junior high school and the high school in Japan, that's, you could say, top down, like the teacher teaches and the students listen. So sometimes they can participate, but it's not like in Europe or in the US where you can have a participation of students. The student can ask questions and they are, incited or invited to give their opinion, to think freely, things like that. I'm not sure it's the case in Japan here in junior high school. And so when students arrive at a university, they stay in the same logic. They've been used to just listening to what the teacher says. And so it takes some time for them to start to think freely. So it will be a big difference. And so the participation of students during classes, I think that's an issue for any foreign teacher arriving in Japan, starting to teach in Japan. So how to make Japanese students participate. So usually you would organize group discussions to have a conversation.
And I think related to the topic that we're going to talk about today, as a clinician, do you experience issues with your clients or analysans related to challenges that they're facing as students, or do you primarily work with families?
I mostly work with foreigners.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. So, for instance, ALT.
Okay, yeah.
And so, which is also very interesting because I have feedbacks on the Japanese school system, both on the side of, for instance, teachers, like foreign teachers working in Japan, teaching English, one type of feedback, but also because I'm studying school non-attendance, school dropouts among Japanese kids, I have another type of knowledge that I can acquire from that, and that I try to explain in my books. And I also make interviews with school counselors in Japan. And so they are really at the forefront of difficulties of Japanese families.
Perhaps before we get into the topic of hikikomori, we can talk a little bit about the experience of being the foreigner either as a student or as a professional in Japan, like I was. In fact, one of the ways that I came to the work of psychoanalysis, or the way that I developed my interest in it, was living here, living abroad in Japan, and experiencing a kind of social isolation, and then later seeking out analysis, to sort of cope with these like terrifying nightmares. I know a lot of my followers, like I've talked about this in previous episodes that I've had about these very vivid dreams that I had while living here. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that, because when I was an ALT, which is an assistant language teacher, one of my roles was I played an informal counselor role. And there were a few times where I had to go to the Seishin Byoin, the mental hospital in Japan, to help foreigners who were briefly institutionalized and that sort of thing. Do you see that as being a problem that's endemic to students who come from foreign countries to study in Japan? Or is this a sort of normal problem that they deal with, a kind of sense of isolation?
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say all, perhaps I'm in a place where I would meet students who complain about what's happening to them after they arrive in Japan. And I was also, it was during the PhD, but I was postdoctoral researcher, so not really student attending classes at Kyoto University. I was already a researcher when I arrived in Japan in 2011. But, I also experienced the difficulty of arriving in Japan, so adapting to the society. Yeah. And up until today, it's true that, human relationships in Japan are kind of cold. Mm-hmm. They are cold. They are cold for Japanese people themselves. That's not easy for everybody. And so it plays a role. There are also many factors to social isolation, but that's one factor.
Well, maybe we can talk a little bit about this phenomenon called hikikomori. This might not be a concept familiar to most Westerners. It refers to a kind of social isolation, but maybe we could talk about, what does hikikomori mean? And maybe you could offer us a basic picture of the social situation of someone who identifies or has been identified as a hikikomori. And also, is this occurrence of the phenomenon, as it's understood in Japan, limited to Japanese society? Is this something that's spreading across the globe? Is it something that's, proliferating or endemic to other cultures?
Yeah, well, the word is Japanese, so that's a big social phenomenon in Japan. To my knowledge, it's not the case in other parts of the world, but obviously there are cases in France, in South Korea, in China, etc. And so these are shut-ins. So people who stay indoors for more than 6 months, and so they avoid many major social interactions. So they don't go to school, they don't go to university, they don't go to work, they don't have social human relationships. And so they stay indoors for more than 6 months. Usually, these are several years. We're talking about several years.
And what is the basic age range of people who this phenomenon is associated with?
So the vast majority are adults. So the thing is that the onset is during adolescence and young adulthood. 90% of the population are adults over 20. So what you find very often is bullying. The vast majority of the narratives of sometimes you say hikikomori survivors, or those who can give an account of their experience of social withdrawal, you would always find bullying in their life history, usually in junior high school, and then a kind of collapse during high school. Very importantly, the school counselor system in the public school, it stops at the end of junior high school. So it's not, there are much less school counselors during high school. So, and because it's not compulsory education, it's as if the teachers and the parents say, okay, student wants to drop out, you can drop out. And so that's the moment where you really have, during high school, the start of hikikomori condition.
I see.
Obviously, you have people who are university students, for instance, or just they graduate from high school and then they start falling into the hikikomori condition.
Are there therapy modalities that have seemed to work, or is there an approach that has been therapeutic?
Yeah, that's the big issue, because it's been 3 decades now, and there's not much improvement. So, there are some videos available on YouTube where you have places, for instance, in the countryside, the small communities where you can do farming, for instance. But here you have volunteers. Somehow it's good because it's not medicalized. People can reintegrate society in a sense, if you speak this way. Yeah? So to me, the NPOs, so contacted by the parents, where you have non-medical staff. Sometimes people who have a bachelor in or training in social work or clinical psychology. You have some of these people working in NPOs, but you also have people who got interested in the phenomenon, and let's say this person has a farm, a business, and wants to work with. Sometimes junior high school students are welcome in this facility, so that's an interesting aspect of Japan. You can sometimes mix minors with adults in these NPOs, which are not strictly regulated. So it allows a certain kind of freedom, but it also allows the opposite. So perhaps it would be interesting that you forward a link to a video that's showing this, because the person speaking is very correct. So you have, just to be more precise, there are businesses who just take the hikikomori person, put him in an apartment, give the food every day that's locked, and they don't do anything. And so you have this kind of dirty company, so to speak. And so it's very difficult to control them by state regulation, because then they can go bankrupt and they reopen somewhere else. Yeah? And on the other hand, you have psychiatric hospitals, clinics, as you went to visit one of them.
Right.
And I saw some articles in the US, like the psychiatric clinic, psychiatric hospital is like a prison. It's a small thing, but in his book, on a very early book, the first book, even before the history of madness, he speaks at some point around Japan.
Right.
And he says something completely wrong. I wrote an article about this, but what's very important for the viewers to know is that institutionalization in Japan is still very strong. It's perhaps the only country in the world, because there's still money to fund it somehow. It's declining now, but deinstitutionalization didn't happen. So 1/5 of available psychiatric beds in the world, they are in Japan. Perhaps some psychiatry specialists would just could argue with this number, but what's true is that deinstitutionalization didn't happen. So you have prescribers, psychiatrists are prescribers. So you just meet them 5 minutes, and you have a pill, or you get hospitalized. And we don't speak about 1 week, and that's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. Still people there in the hospital for a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades. It doesn't happen anymore in France, obviously in the US, in many other countries. And so just since the last decade, it started what's called the transfer to the community. Also because of the lack of manpower, of nurses. The lack of nurses next year, the data is like 300,000 nurses that are lacking in Japan.
Yeah.
So it's the aging population, that's the issue, and the aging population has dementia. The psychiatric issues in the end are mostly for the aging population here in Japan. And so what's interesting is that you have still very strong institutionalization, and at the same time social isolation, the big phenomenon of social isolation. And There is a psychotherapy available, but not to the extent that you find in the US and France.
Right.
And it's still difficult to pay to talk. And to talk is a little bit difficult for the Japanese population, even when they have issues.
Mm-hmm.
So in the end, they find other ways to deal with their own issues.
Let's talk a little bit more about the theoretical side of things. We brought up Foucault. And in the paper that you gave me, and I'm going to put a link to that paper in the show notes for the YouTube viewers and for those who listen to the podcast, you make extensive use of Foucault's work to construct this lineage of the treatment of social abnormality from what you call an initial social sensitivity of normalizing forces, when we think about the inception of the clinic, right? And then, of course, it leads onward to an entire history of various forms of alienation of abnormal subjects in Foucault's work, ultimately through the force of what Foucault calls psychiatric power. But then you suggest that in the 21st century, we will see the end of psychiatry as the paradigm for the medicalization of abnormality, or we might. But perhaps before you explain your view about that, could you give us a brief overview of how you think Foucault charts the evolution of social exclusion of abnormal subjects in the history of madness? And then tell us about the shift that you now perceive with respect to the medicalization or lack of medicalization of social isolation.
So I was trained in psychology, so when you're doing the bachelor's, the master's, you read some writings of Foucault, but you don't necessarily read everything. And so it was actually after I finished my PhD in psychopathology. Mm-hmm. So there were kind of 5 chapters on social isolation, so from school non-attendance to Hikikomori. Mm-hmm. And after that, I thought, how can I think about Hikikomori, social isolation in Japan, in a wider perspective, in the history of, so we can call it madness or abnormality, mm-hmm. And unreason. That's a great word.
Yes, yeah.
In a sense, the Hikikomori people are not reasonable. How is it they don't want to work?
Right.
And especially in Japan, the fact of not working, even questioning the very fact that an individual should work, is it well accepted? I'm not sure about that. Mm-hmm. I know some Hikikomori groups. They are doing sometimes demonstrations on the street, and there are more cops than people in the demonstration.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I've never heard of that. So wait, hold on a second. So people who identify as Hikikomori will come out and do protests.
Yes, when they are a little bit better, when they are able to come out.
Oh, I see. Okay.
But it's like addiction, for instance, alcohol addiction. You don't drink alcohol anymore, but sometimes you are at risk of coming back into the addiction, right?
Right.
So the moment they are in this state, they find an association, for instance, an NPO that helps them. And so one of them that I know, they sometimes organize demonstrations, and so there's pictures of that. And what's really impressive is that the moment that they go out saying, yes, we are Hikikomori, and so the words they want to say, there's instantly so many cops, and people are not interested. It's just like, what are you doing here?
Wow.
And so it doesn't, how to say, invite you, as a Hikikomori person to participate to society. The moment you go out, you speak, and you have all the cops and just ordinary people between 2 train stations. They just don't care. It's just that when Foucault speaks about the ship of fools, for instance, that there's a fool in your game of Tarot.
Right, that's right.
The fool is who is the fool?
It's Artaud. It's Antonin Artaud.
Antonin Artaud.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So to me, just hikikomori, you cannot medicalize it. You cannot say it's a psychiatric pathology. It's not a mental disorder. It's something different.
Right.
And so if you look at the history of psychiatry, or before that, history of madness, what concept do you have? So yes, in the end, that's Fuko. So the abnormal, these figures of the abnormal, or before that, the ship of fools.
Yeah.
And so I was just still wondering if hikikomori is not this illustration of the abnormal in the 21st century, and the kind of return of unreason in the 21st century. I'm not sure it is, but that's the question.
Well, I think the interesting claim that you make is that with the oncoming of the hikikomori phenomenon, we see the end of psychiatry, or at least the diminishing of psychiatry. Maybe you could say more about that.
Yeah, and actually, the people who are speaking about the end of psychiatry, for instance, that's Harvard professor Arthur Kleinman. So he doesn't speak about hikikomori, but there are many psychiatrists who are thinking that at least clinical psychiatry is collapsing.
Yeah.
So just that, more simply said, the very fact that he's a prescriber to a psychiatrist. So, in the tradition I was raised in France, a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, very much interested in psychopathology, there's a lot of knowledge in Germany, in Great Britain, in France, in the US, and you learn all of these things to think, to conceptualize what's happening to people who are suffering and are coming to meet you. So in the end, you can take it as this, you make hypotheses on mental disorders, if you are a psychiatrist, or the structure of the subject, if you are a psychoanalyst. So actually, I cannot be a Foucauldian because I'm an analyst.
Right.
So that's a different type of discourse. Lacan gave some formulas of the discourses, and to me, you cannot operate within psychoanalytical discourse, and being a Foucauldian. That's a matter of structure. That's not possible.
Right.
So I will use Foucault in perhaps it's a little bit simplistic, but that's the way I use it to think about the dynamics of power over time. And so when he talks about psychiatric power, perhaps why I was interested in history of management and psychiatric power, that's because he didn't see the 80s, the rise of mental health and how mental health absorbed psychiatry. Psychiatry became something in mental health.
Right.
So what was interesting for me is conceptualization of power. So power is not something that belongs to someone. So I think that's very, very important.
No, absolutely.
And
yeah.
Also including the Foucauldian that use what Foucault wrote today, it's very important not to, I think, to use lectures on psychiatric power and to apply it now. Because in the end, if you think about France, for instance, a psychiatrist or psychologist working in the hospitals, they are suffering as much as their patients. They just can't work. It's awful. And so when sometimes the Foucauldian approach would convey psychiatric power or something like they will have some sort of power, but actually they are powerless. They don't decide. The managers decide.
Right.
The capitalists decide. And in Japan, still, you have the association of the directors of psychiatric hospitals, and they are all psychiatrists. So in the sense, they still have a leading position, but the cost was to become the capitalist. They are not psychiatrists anymore. So psychiatry is already dead.
Well, that raises an interesting question. If intellectually you're committed to Lacan and Lacanian psychoanalysis, how do you view the problem of hikikomori through the lens of Lacan?
Yeah, but I must say I'm not committed to Lacan.
Okay.
I'm not a dogmatic Lacanian, but I have the same type attitude, like I hope many of my colleagues, the psychoanalysts, have, is to really, when you have a subject coming to speak to you, you're committed to his or her being. That's the commitment.
Right.
What do you think Lacan would say about the hikikomori phenomenon?
He would invite hikikomori people to his seminars. And,
what concept in Lacan's corpus of concepts would help us understand the nature of that phenomenon?
First, the thing is that the analyst has something to say when someone asks something to him or her. And so the problem is that a hikikomori person doesn't ask anything. And even these days, they are not the only ones. Also, that even if you have a mental health issue and you go to see a cognitive behavioral therapist or any kind of therapist, if you have a mental health issue, it's not that you are asking something really. You have a symptom, you want the symptom to disappear, you want to get better in your life. But you see that the analyst has a completely different position, a more radical position. The analyst even doesn't want you to get better. You know, what an evil person it is. I don't even care about the mental health of people coming next to me. You know, it's not that extreme. The analyst is also a human being. But you need to have that kind of position as an analyst to, yes, there's a very impairing symptom, something in your life. It's important perhaps that it decreases for you to live better, obviously. But there's also the issue of changing your position as a subject. That you kind of expect a change in your position in life that cannot be reduced to you getting better or erasing your symptom. And so very importantly, in my opinion, people who want you to get better, you should avoid them at any cost. Because there's an assumption on what's good for you. How do people know what's good for you? Sometimes you don't even know yourself. And sometimes you enjoy suffering in some circumstances. And why not? So the analysis has that's why I always say, that's what we are taught in the French psychoanalytical setting. It has nothing to do with psychotherapy. Nothing to do. Completely separate. First, you don't want the person to get better. Second, the reduction of the symptom is not enough, and you have a very specific focus on the signifier. So some elements that the person would say.
I see.
And so, to come back to the hikikomori people, first you need to have a kind of integrative approach. So because you need to do home visits, you need to contact them. So first, there's something that's not really psychoanalytical, except if you think about Breuer, you know, at the beginning of the treatment of hysteria, the pioneers of psychoanalysis were doing home visits. So it's not completely anti-psychoanalytic, but you don't say comfortably on your couch. You must go search for them. Go search for the hikikomori people, and then start to speak about them. And you cannot do formally a psychoanalysis. Perhaps you can apply psychoanalytic notions to the phenomenon, but it's a little bit top-down. So I'm not sure that Lacan would have anything to say. It's a very impure phenomenon. So that's why the Foucauldian approach might be interesting. So the kind of references to Lacan, Foucault, and other people would perhaps help us explain better the phenomenon.
Well, then this brings us to the sort of next question and subtopic here. You suggest a few times in your paper that the plight of social isolation is symptomatic of the coupling of biopower, Foucault's biopower, and neoliberalism, insofar as the life of the hikikomori person is marked by its reduction to a mere survival. So in other words, when we think about what the life of somebody living in social isolation is like, it's one of pure survival, eating, repeating, abstaining from work, abstaining from social relations. And this is symptomatic of what we see under neoliberalism with the way that people who don't experience social isolation, how they live and work sometimes. Often it's just a case of living paycheck to paycheck, trying to reskill yourself for new jobs, no retirement in sight. What do you think the connection between the hikikomori phenomenon and neoliberalism and capitalism are?
So first, to my knowledge, you can afford being hikikomori only in industrialized society. rich societies. So you need at least to find some food somewhere to survive, right?
Right.
So in the end, in Japan, hikikomori people, they just go to the konbini, so they would just go out at night. And as you know, when you go to convenience store in Japan, you don't have to speak to anybody. You just grab some food, pay. Even now, that's a machine where you pay. So you don't have to talk to anybody. You can just go on the street, see nobody, and go there, take your food, and come back. So you can live this life for forever if you have a smaller amount of money. It would be more difficult in many other countries compared to Japan. So Japan created the conditions where you can be hikikomori, can survive as a hikikomori. It also creates the condition where it's difficult to be homeless also. There are homeless in some areas in Tokyo, in Osaka, but if you take your camera in Kyoto today, you go out of the university, you go. Sometimes you can see homeless in the Kamo River.
That's right.
But you can count them. Huh?
Right.
1, 2, 3, 0. It's not the US, right? So, and what I always say is that the hikikomori are the homeless at home. And they are really abandoned. And for cultural reasons, the way you abandon people here is very passively, is in the family, in the room. Mm-hmm. They still have a roof above their head, but they're completely abandoned. And they are in poverty. So, in some cases, you have middle-class families, upper-class families, so they are not in poverty in this case. But there are many cases falling into poverty. Just imagine there was a housewife, the father, 1 children, the father dies, and then they don't have much money to come to survive. They don't have much money, so they are just below the poverty line. They have a roof above their head. They can survive. I think, to me, the link between the motto of biopower, make survive. I take it also from Agamben. So Foucauldian would perhaps argue, I have a simplistic approach to Foucault. So I take it as make survive, and it's connected to some development of capitalistic society.
I thought that was also an interesting point in your paper, where you talk about the distinction between Zoe and bios, right? The separation of the survival and living. And what we see in the figure of the hikikomori is somebody who's relegated to survival. I think that brings me to what might be my last big question, which is, given that you're a psychoanalyst by training, it seems that in your paper that you are still committed in some sense to some sort of psychiatric intervention. I mean, given the nature of the neoliberal milieu, the capitalist landscape, how is it even possible to conduct a traditional psychiatric or psychoanalytic intervention with these kinds of folks? Is there any sort of impetus for practical action that we can take, to help these people who are isolated?
With Lacan, what Lacan brought to the table or to the couch was erasing the training. So no didactic trainings, no training. So when you start your own analysis, at some point there's an end, and you're not sure if it will produce an analyst. You don't know. So it produces an analyst or not. It can produce the university professor. It can produce an artist. It can produce a teacher. It can produce just someone who is more comfortable in his life. Comfortable. Life is more bearable for the person. The person is more bearable for others too, because sometimes your symptoms, for instance, obsessive compulsive symptoms, can be very annoying for other people.
Right.
It also impacts you. So that the type of thing you can change them. So yes, you're not an analyst by training. Your analysis produces an analyst or not. And you that's why there's no certificate.
Mm-hmm.
And if there's a certificate of psychoanalytic psychotherapist, it proves that it's not a psychoanalyst. So there's no certificate of psychoanalyst. It's psychoanalysis. It's a function that is encountered by an analyzer. So, yes, I think that's a very important distinction and very difficult to explain. Because the analyst is not a mental health professional, so to speak.
I see.
I was president of mental health professional organization, but it's not a mental health professional. That's something different.
I see.
And different from a psychotherapist. It was a comment on just a small thing you said.
But it seems important to answering the other question, which is like, what is to be done?
What is to be done? Yeah, it's always. I cannot help enhancing the difficulties. So I have not solved the issue yet. So, for instance, you have two important people in Japan who are treating hikikomori people. So there's one psychiatrist, Professor Kato in Kyushu University, and there's another psychiatrist, Professor Saito Tamaki, the one who wrote the first book on hikikomori in 1998. So they too have their own clinic, but the problem is that it's not enough for the whole Japan.
Right.
So it's perhaps interesting to have a kind of interview with them on what are they doing. And also there are these psychiatrists. Then there are ordinary psychiatric clinics where you have prescriptions. So in the end, the hikikomori person stays at home with the parents and comes out once a month to have the pills, to antidepressant, antipsychotics, whatever. And then you have NPOs, but they help only a minority of people, and it has a cost. That's why one of the reasons why the situation didn't change much in 3 decades for hikikomori people. Yeah. And so when it comes to psychoanalysis, I still have people contacting me. For instance, the sister of a hikikomori person. And so how do I do to help the person? I will listen to the sister. We talk together. Is there a way that we can contact your brother? Very difficult. So can we start with his father or his mother? The mother, that's impossible. So perhaps I can start with the father. I can talk to him. Okay, I will talk with him about it. Okay, and so obviously the father will not come to visit me, so I will have to come to visit him.
Right.
And is it possible to go at his place? No, it's not possible because there's the mother and the hikikomori person. So you have to go very slowly. And so how can I connect with the father? Or perhaps does he have a hobby? Yeah. So he's interested in Japanese temples or castles. Okay, so we'll have a walk together. He will make me visit the castle and explain the culture, and we can start talking about his son. Even doing this, when you do all these efforts, it's still very difficult to reach, for instance, one of the two parents. Because after 2 decades, the situation is so crystallized, so even more than rusty. It doesn't move, and it's at some point the parents are 70, and somehow they gave up. So they are with a hikikomori person in his 40s, getting 50. To me, still many things can be done, but you have a person who stayed for 2 decades in social isolation. So sometimes, even if at the beginning he really had a light, not severe mental disorder or started to be depressed, but after 2 decades, if you don't do anything, then anybody gets worse. After 2 decades in social isolation. There's a lot of barriers to both psychotherapy and psychoanalysis for hikikomori people, but that's not a reason why we should not try, because the way they are abandoned, ethically speaking, you cannot vet this type of abandonment. So somehow it's important to protest and to say, no, we won't let you live this way. But if you want, that's fine. But at least we will try to find together other solutions in your life, if that's fine. And so, unfortunately, this can have effects if you start early. So if you start with high school students or young adults, you have more chances to change the situation.
Mm.
So to me, the hope would be here, but that's a lot of investment. Also, before talking about psychoanalysis, the very fact of just someone spending 3 hours, for instance, to make a home visit of 1 hour, because in the end, we are here. If we are called by someone to do a home visit, it will take us 1 hour to go there. We stay 1 hour, and we take 1 hour to go back. So think about the money, the fee for a session. In 3 hours, you can meet 6 patients.
Right.
You would meet just one.
Mm-hmm.
Would you make the patient pay, the hourly rate for a session? For instance, when you want between $100 to $200, you will make the person pay only $300, $600 for only one home visit.
Right.
So if there's no strong welfare state supporting this, whatever the approach, it can't be done. And that's why nothing improved until now. That's the case. You need much more money from the state to solve the issue. And so if the Japanese government didn't do it really, the question is that perhaps there's a benefit to it, or they don't really want to change the situation.
I see.
Same thing for the gender, men-women issues in Japan, perhaps, or declining birth rate. Perhaps they don't want to change anything. There's a benefit to this, and just there's a superficial discourse on all the aging society, the men-women inequality. Let's have more women in leadership, 1% every year. It's the case for so many times.
Right.
If it doesn't change, there might be some reason, some benefit.
I see.
Well, Nicolas, it was really great talking with you. I appreciate you taking your time out of your busy day here to have this conversation with me and introducing the phenomenon of Hikikomori to the many listeners of our podcast. So thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'd like to speak longer, but that's so. But usually the analysts don't speak much, but in this case, I thought there's much to be said, and so I hope you viewers can have a look at. My book is open access, so
excellent.
Definitely have a look, and also I hope I also give another impression of perhaps Lacanian psychoanalysis.
Sure. Yeah, on the Deleuzian channel, Lacan often doesn't play very well, but I think you are an exception.
Yeah, I hope I'm not, because I know many colleagues, and so the Lacanians, that's not only dogmatic people, let's say transphobic people, etc. That's perhaps the one who are most visible.
Yeah.
But it's on the ground, that's not the case.
Well, great. Well, thank you again, Nicolas.
Welcome.